Hi, everybody. I do have some images to share just to give you a sense of the people that I'm talking about and the issues I'm talking about, although I have to say I can't offer the belly laughs that Angela did with some of those memes, but there we go. Okay. So, this is a guy that I'm going to focus on. He's a local media personality and activist called Harvard Yemeni, and it will become clear why I'm talking about this particular person as I proceed. Mark Davis's and Davina Loam's Pandemics, Publics and Narratives presciently established how stories and audiences are both pivotal to successful health communication. It's helpful to understand pandemic communication as transmedia stories linking disease with essentially political views of the world. Ideally, pandemic narratives improve health outcomes by infusing information with meaning and relevance. That said, history and scholarship have shown how adept audiences are at leading media stories in different directions. Take Melbourne's anti-lockdown protests of September 2021. Front and center in the chaos and media coverage was a gym owner turned media personality called Harvard Yemeni, who is the person that you see in front of you. Yemeni began his career as an ordinary person who changed a TV story he didn't like. In 2015, Yemeni's Caulfield-based Krav Maga business attracted media criticism. Several things led to several other things, and by 2021, the one-time gym owner was an anti-lockdown lightning rod and a figure of national interest. Yemeni's story guides us through the terrain of narrative pandemic communication. Davis and Loam warned that a growing optimism about narrative persuasion was resurrecting the much discredited hypodermic needle communication model. Their point is significant since researchers today find themselves in a research economy that is remarkably similar to that faced by an earlier generation of so-called hypodermic needle researchers. This paper briefly charts how media audience research developed as a reaction against persuasion studies, and was then found itself subjected to the same sorts of criticisms that were directed at those studies. Yemeni's story is exemplary here, as we can argue that his celebrity sits comfortably within the logic of media systems that have weaponized active audiences. And here I'm drawing on the work of Dana Boyd. So let's start by looking at where audiences sit in pandemic communication. And I'm going to be talking a lot about the work of, there's a scholar here called Henry Jenkins, and there are a couple of his key books here. The phrase hypodermic needle tradition is usually applied to the North American mass communication scholars who dominated post-war media studies. As the story goes, and I should say I'm talking about a kind of a conventional story that's contestable, but that's another paper. But anyway, World War II allied America's government, media, and philanthropists as they seduced psychologists and sociologists into searching for laws of persuasion that did not exist. Worse still, the lure of industrial and state funding blinkered scholarly imaginations when it came to thinking through how audiences lived social lives through media experiences. The net effect was that vastly simplified conceptions of media power pervaded policy spaces precisely as mass media assumed unprecedented anchoring roles in social life. The criticism of mass communication's administrative bent helped spark a qualitative turn in audience research. Again, according to conventional accounts, qualitative scholars eschew persuasion, favoring a more modest goal, which was appreciating how audiences used media to make social worlds. Famously, American scholar Henry Jenkins argued that narrative engagement empowered audiences. Beginning with his study on Star Trek fans who organized against heteronormative media cultures, Jenkins' fan research was the platform for his subsequent work on the democratic potential of convergent media industries. Jenkins' convergence culture cast fan communities as prototypes for mediatized democracies. Here, popular organisation and activism against partial or non-inclusive media stories about how things are could become a productive and common feature of social and political life. However, to some eyes, this merely resurrected magic bullet or hypodermic needle type thinking. Critics view Jenkins' work as a handy apology for global commercial media industries. In offering narratives as raw materials that audiences use to roll their own narratives, and that's a quote from Jenkins, Jenkins also, to his detractors, suggested that the solutions to society's problems lay within the logic of global media systems. In the 50s and 60s, scholars had taken industry shillings to look for magic bullets, but when they didn't find them, they concluded that media messages had limited influences on audiences who still turned to trusted confidence when in need of advice. To his detractors, Jenkins sailed right into the same harbour. The problem with faith in audiences' participatory capacities was that it left little to say about media systems. So audience studies sometimes lean on audiences to solve industry problems. We can find that tendency in pandemic studies. In some parts of the world, housebound families have started watching TV together again. Rejuvenated co-viewing reminds us that TV was once a welcome educational tool that brought families teachable moments. This has invigorated enthusiasm for public service TV and its power as an educational resource. Elsewhere, health communication professionals hope audiences can actively create public service announcements. Social media platforms have been identified as vital resources where the public participate in COVID information by sharing stories about daily experiential anxieties the pandemic has invoked. There are certainly grounds for regarding audiences today as participants in the co-creation of productive pandemic narratives. But figures like Yemeni make just as much sense. Just remind you who he is again. Yemeni is currently the Australian correspondent for Canada's Rebel News, an organisation that Justin Trudeau has condemned as a willing propagator of COVID disinformation. Last week, ABC's Media Watch highlighted Yemeni's role in the anti-lockdown protests that engulfed the CFMEU's Melbourne headquarters. The Rebel News reporter's apparent popularity among protesters was contrasted with the venom and violence directed at broadcast news journalists. The ABC's point was how bad faith media activists exploited pandemic communication to further their own political and commercial agendas. However, there are grounds for arguing that Yemeni is not acting against the grain. Back in 2018, noted social media expert Dana Boyd argued that figures like Yemeni sit easily within the story of media literate fan democracies. His rise is not a symbol of digital chaos. It is symbolic of how mediatization harnesses audiences to commercial media logic. In 2015, Yemeni was a small business owner who sought to publicize his martial arts gym by offering firearms training to ordinary Melburnians. This grabbed the attention of Channel 10's The Project, prompted a stoush with Waleed Ali, and propelled Yemeni into media activism. From orchestrating moral panics over African gangs to support for former English Defence League leader Tommy Robinson. That's the picture up here to your right. That's Tommy Robinson, who also incidentally counts Morrissey, the English rock singer, disgraced English rock singer, I must say, amongst his fans. And now to anti-lockdown activism. There is a logic to Yemeni's career progression that turns our attention from media users to media systems. Australian concerns about Yemeni, Rukshan Fernando, and the troubled citizen journalist cause alert us to how deeply COVID has shaken optimism about the potential of convergent media cultures. Social media dynamics have been identified as central to the propagation of misinformation and conspiracy, where understanding how social media systems lend themselves to such narratives is a precursor to any understanding of audience activity. Terry Flew frames concerns over COVID communication as symptoms of a far more significant trust crisis. Populism and the pandemic have twinned to underscore a global disconnection between authority and audience. This disjuncture is the structural pretext for any debate about how media might serve better health outcomes. Just flip ahead here. The thing about hypodermic needle thinking is that no one ever really thought it existed. For a long time, this was a handy straw figure for audience scholars who wanted to dodge difficult questions. Succinctly, one can argue that studies focusing on audiences' capacities do a public disservice, and that COVID-19 has underlined rumblings that could be heard in some circles well before 2020. Overall, it's vital to recognize that today's audience scholars face the same dilemmas that confronted the so-called hypodermic needle tradition. Anti-vaxxers make sense in media systems that thrive on endless narrative chains and the revenues accrued by those who would write them for free. It's all very well for the ABC to urge Australians to ignore Kevin from Facebook, but those appeals should know that audience studies teaches us that information is way down the list on why people use media. From early cinema studies, through radio and TV, and onto social media, audiences want company, recognition, and a feeling of belonging above all else. Even Avi Yemeni just started as a bloke who wanted people to dig his gym. Audience researchers have indeed found imaginative and productive engagement with pandemic narratives. But the main lesson of audience studies is that if we want solutions to pandemic communication problems, then we shouldn't ask the audience. It isn't their job. And that's it. Thank you very much for listening.